Alright guys, we are gonna have a short video here about writing trig equations from graphs. And you're gonna need to pull all these things out. So we're gonna find the amplitude of the equation. Basically, if you find the midline first, or you find out how far above and below the midline the equation is going, those will give you the amplitude, the a value, and the k value. Okay? The period, remember you can measure the period from anywhere as long as you get one full cycle in. Doesn't matter if you're calling it sine or cosine, the period is the same. And then to find the b that goes in the equation, you take 2 pi divided by whatever period you figured out on the graph. Because it is the opposite, remember, let's see, we did the period was 2 pi divided by b. So now if we multiply the b over here and divide, we'll get b equals 2 pi divided by the period. So that's going to tell you what goes in here. And then any shift left or right goes in here. You can put extra parentheses here. And that's how we're going to write the equation. So for this equation, it says examine the graph below and determine the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift of each using a cosine. So we have to call this a cosine. When I look at it, it looks like a sine graph, the shape. But if I start measuring here, okay, then it is a cosine graph that would finish over here somewhere. But the period is the same no matter whether we measure it from there to there, or we say one cycle starts here and ends here. So the period is pi, which means the value we put in is going to be 2 pi divided by pi, or just 2. The midline for this one is just the x-axis, or y equals 0. So there is no shift up or down. And it goes up as high as 5 and as low as -5, so the amplitude is just 5. What are we missing? Anything? We have to call it a cosine graph. Okay, if we're going to call it a cosine, then we measure from the peak forward, from the maximum forward. So we're going to say that it shifted to the right pi over 4. So our equation will be y equals amplitude of 5, cosine, they said we had to call it. We said b was 2. We said if we're going to make it a cosine, we have to say it has a shift to the right pi over 4. Remember the opposite sign in here. And it had no shift up or down. The midline was at 0, so we're done. Or you can put an extra parenthesis here. Now, you could graph this on your calculator to check it. Okay, you could type this in and set the window like they did, and it should turn out just like this. If you're going to use the calculator, remember your mode for graphing has to be in radians. We are graphing in radians. All right. This one also says to use a cosine. So this one's actually easier than the first one, because if we call this a cosine, we can just say it starts here and finishes here. Okay? So the period is 2 pi, the length of one cycle. So then 2 pi divided by 2 pi makes b just 1. The amplitude, well, let's see, this is 1, 2, the maxes are at 3, but the mins are at -1. So we could figure the amplitude by saying max minus min divided by 2, which would be 4 divided by 2. The amplitude is going to be 2. But you could have also figured out where the midline was first. Okay, it was a distance of 4 top to bottom. So that was 2 below here is the midline, 2 above here is the midline. So our midline is y equals 1. So it has a vertical shift, or a k value, of +1. I don't think we need anything else. We don't need a period, a phase shift, because it started right where it should on the x or the y-axis. So we have y equals an amplitude of 2, cosine b, which is just 1, and it didn't shift left or right, so we just have x. You could put parentheses around that or not. But then on the back, it shifted up 1, okay? So again, remember, this is amplitude, and this is the vertical shift or the midline. That's going to be a big issue when we do the word problems that go with these. All right. Number 3, of course, says that even though this looks like a cosine graph right here, we're supposed to write an equation to make it a sine graph. Now, a sine graph means it needs to start doing this, or we could call it a negative sine, and that means it would start by doing this, down first. So we have a couple options, and actually these have infinite right answers because they repeat, so you could always shift them further left or right. Let's see, if this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, our midline is y equals 3. Wow, was there notes on the rest of this and I didn't? Okay. Yep, totally missed that on the last 2 slides. The amplitude here was 2. Now, the period from here until it hits a peak is 6 pi. Even though we're not graphing this as a cosine, that is 1 complete cycle. So the period is 6 pi. So b is going to be 2 pi divided by 6 pi, or 1/3. That's what we're going to put into the equation. 6 pi doesn't go into the equation, the 1/3 does. We're going to have a phase shift, but let's talk about the vertical shift is up 3, and that's going to go on the back. All right. The equation, let's see, it's going to need a plus 3 back here and an amplitude of 2. Now we have to decide. It looks to me like it would be easiest to say it starts at the midline here and goes down first, and that would mark up a sine graph, a negative sine graph. So we would put negative sine. The b was 1/3, remember? And then you're telling me we're going to say it shifts to the right, 3 pi over 2. We'd need a couple parentheses back there. All right. Or if you want to say that you don't want a negative sign, this was the negative sign shape. If you want to say it's a positive sign, you could say it shifted all the way over to here. Which would be a positive sine graph then. Or you could go backwards. Let's see. This is a distance 1/2 of a loop here from 9 pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2 is 6 pi over 2's. So if you went backwards from 3 pi over 2, it would be at negative 3 pi over 2. That it hit the midline here. So it's possible you could say, I want a positive sine graph, but to do that, I'm going to shift it to the left 3 pi over 2. All right, I know this is tricky, but all of these equations work. Maybe I'll just take a second and show you that that's true. If we put the calculator mode in radians, which it is right here, should say radians at the top of your screen if you have it in radians, and we go to y equals, and you know I don't type very fast on these, but we have negative 2 sine 1/3 extra parenthesis x minus 3 pi over 2, 2 parentheses plus 3, or 2 sine 1/3 x minus 9 pi over 2, or 2 sine 1/3 x plus 3 pi over 2. Now we want to set our window the same as theirs, so we can tell if we're matching what they did. Their window here was like -1 to maybe 6 going up and down. And we could set it from like -3 pi over 2 to 6 or 7 pi if you want it, or yeah, just to keep going out this way a little bit further than they did so that it fits. So for my window, I'm going to go ahead right here and say -3 pi over 2, because then it should start right there where we did at 3, if we did this right. And the maximum x on the right, we can just leave it at 6 pi to see if it finishes exactly where we did, but that would be up here, remember, it should finish. Whoops, I don't know what I typed there. All right, and then bottom to top, the bottom is at like -1, and the top was at 5. I'm going to go ahead and put 6 because I don't want it to be cut off or bumping against the top. All right, let's see what happens. Wow, did you see what happened there? What happened really fast, but all 3 colors went by. Okay, it graphed as blue, then it graphed as red, then it graphed as black. I don't think I can do that again unless I go mode. I don't know. I think it's already done unless I turn them all off and back on. All right, but all of those are the same and they all match this graph. All right, I'm not going to do a bunch on the calculator because it takes me a lot of time. You'll just have to trust me. We're going to examine this graph and they want us to write it as a sine. Now normally a sine starts at the midline and goes up. So we could say it phase shifted here to the right pi over 5. Or we could call it a sine that started here but was negative. That would work as well. All right, the amplitude, the midline is just y equals 0, so it has no vertical shift. It's going down to -1/2 and up to 1/2, so the amplitude number is always a positive number. The period, it finishes a cycle by 2 pi over 5. So to find the b value that goes into the equation, we take 2 pi divided by 2 pi over 5, which is the same as 2 pi times 5 over 1. No, just kidding. 2 pi times, we're flipping this over, so it's 5 over 2 pi. Okay, and then we just get 5. So b is going to be 5, which makes sense, right? Normally you take 2 pi divided by whatever b is to get the period. So 2 pi divided by 5, yep, that's the period. Phase shift, well, if we're going to do a positive sign, we're going to go to the right pi over 5. If we're going to do a negative sign, then we don't need one. And so to write this equation, we can say an amplitude of 1/2, because that's where the maxes and mins are. And we were told to call this a sine. The b value was 5. If we wanted to say it started here and went up and then down, and then it would go back up over here somewhere, okay? that is a shift to the right pi over 5. And it had no vertical shift. The midline was at y equals 0. So we'd be good. If you wanted to call it a negative sign, it could have been even shorter. You could have said I reflected it, and it's a sine with a period of 5, but I don't need a phase shift because a negative sine shape, remember, starts at the midline, goes down like that. So it's very easily a negative sign that finishes at 2 pi over 5. All right. I'm going to go back up because obviously on 1 and 2 I missed this. Let's see, this had 5 pi. What did we use for a phase shift? To the right, pi over 4. And did this one have a vertical shift? Nope, the midline was at 0. And then we wrote our equation already. And on number 2, the amplitude was 2, the phase shift was up 1, and the period was 2 pi. And we didn't need a phase shift when we did a plain old cosine, because it was nicely, had its maximum on the y-axis. All right. Now we are on to these. This one I need you to cross off. I could talk about it, but it's not nicely graphed at all. Okay, it's like in the middle of nowhere. There's crossing and you can't tell if it's at the 1/2. I just want to skip that one. We don't need it. We got plenty of practice here. All right, this one is what we're going to get to tomorrow. Is I'm going to tell you a story and you have to put the graph together. But for today, I gave you the graph. And it has a maximum at 70, and it has a minimum over here at 10. So that is a distance of 60. So halfway in between here is the midline of 40. Now, I don't know why suddenly students start having trouble with where's the midline go and where's the amplitude go. If you take 70 and 10, that's 80. You add it together, divide by 2, you get the midline. Okay? The midline is max plus min divided by 2. It's the average. The amplitude is how far above and below that it's going. So it's actually max minus min divided by 2. You don't have to use the formula. You can just go over here and go, wait, the midline is at 40, so that's a distance of 30, or from 40 down to 10 is also a distance of 30. So the amplitude goes out front, the midline goes at the back. All right, the easiest thing to do would be just to call this a sine graph because it started at the middle, went up and down. So if we just call it a sine, then we don't need a phase shift, sorry. We don't need a phase shift left or right. The period, it's finishing at 50 weeks. So the period is 50. So what goes into the equation is 2 pi over 50. Or if we reduce, it's pi over 25. So we're going to have a pi over 25 times x in here. And you can put parentheses if you want. All right, so 30 was above and below, was sine because it started at the middle. It finished a period at 50, so we had to do 2 pi over 50 to figure out pi over 25 went into the equation. And it was shifted a midline up at 40. All right, if we had done it as a cosine, we would have had to say it shifted to the right. Actually, let's see, halfway to 25. Halfway to 50 would be, this would be 25, and we'd have to say that this shifted to the right at 12.5. I think it would be much easier to do that one as a sine. Okay, if you did it as a cosine, I wouldn't even bother to write this down if I was you, but you would say it shifted to the right 12.5, and then you could have made it a cosine. Okay? I'm not going to make you, on the application problems we do, I'm going to let you pick what you want, sine or cosine. All right. This one, I'm going to make you do both. Okay, what do we got going? Maxes are at 7, mins are at 1. So if you add those together, that's 8. That makes the amplitude, the midline 4. And the amplitude means they're going 3 above that and 3 below. It's a distance here of 6. 7 minus 1 is 6, so it's 3 above and 3 below. So the amplitude is 3. And the vertical shift is up 4. If it's a sine or a cosine, same difference. All right, now we can figure out the period by looking at it as a sine or cosine. It doesn't matter. So it finishes one cycle here, and I'm going to call that 4 pi. I know it took kind of a big dot, didn't quite make it there, but we're going to go with 4 pi. So the period is going to be 4 pi. So B is 2 pi divided by 4, or 1/2. So if I wrote an equation with a 1/2 x, you would say the period is 2 pi divided by 1/2, which would become 4 pi. All right. What's going on? Easier to write this as a sine or cosine? I would say it's easier to write this one as a sine because it starts at the midline, goes up and then down. So if we call it a sine first, the amplitude is 3, and the midline at the back is plus 4. If we have to call it a cosine, we have to say, well, the peak was here, and it started and went down, and that's the cosine shape, okay? And so it started to the right pi over 4, or I'm sorry, to the right pi. Where I got that. So the amplitude is still 3, but we switched it to a cosine. The B is still 1/2, but we had to shift to the right pi in order to have a cosine shape going on. All right. I know these are tricky. One more. By the way, there's more than one answer, okay? You could have called this a negative cosine and say it started at negative, it started at 3 pi, so it shifted to the right 3 pi. You could have gone back this way. There's lots of equations. That's my job to figure out if you have one that's right. Your quiz on this is just matching multiple choice, so just find one that works. All right, so here we have, I'm going to go with that's one cycle. So even though it doesn't look like it's crossing at 0 here, I'm going to say that this max is here and here. So this distance is 1 period. And 5 pi over 4s minus 1 pi over 4 is a distance of 4 pi over 4s, or pi. So the period is 4, no matter what we, or pi, no matter what we call it. So the B is going to be 2 pi over that pi we found. So our B is going to be 2. All right. If we want to call it, let's see. If we want to do cosine first, maybe? Well, let's finish here. The amplitude, it goes from 2 to negative 4. So that is a distance of 6. Okay. 3 and 3 makes the midline actually be at 1, which is why it's looking kind of wonky. Okay, the midline is here at 1. So the vertical shift is -1 for either sine or cosine. And then the amplitude is 3 above that to +2 and 3 below that to -4. So if it's a sine, it's going to be y equals 3 with a minus 1 at the back. If it's a cosine, it's still going to be y equals 3 with a minus 1 at the back. And both of these will have a 2 for the b value. So we're going to have sine of 2 something and cosine of 2 something. Now, this one has a lot of options. If we are doing it as a sine graph, I would say it would be easiest to say it started here, but we'd have to figure out what that is. Actually, it would be here, sorry. But we got to figure out what this x coordinate is. Halfway between 1 pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4 would be 2 pi over 4s, which would actually reduce to a pi over 2. If we want to do a cosine, you could say it shifted left pi over 4 or right 3 pi over 4. Either one will get you a maximum. So we could say left pi over 4 or right 3 pi over 4. All right, and the sine graph, we could have done a negative sign or something, but we're all good. All right, I think that was the last one. All right, guys, so your job is to do the worksheet. I would highly suggest you do all of the problems. I think there's only 8 of them, and it asks you specifically to find a sine or cosine, I think. So look them all over and ask questions on the ones you don't understand next time we have a meet.